Hello students, today I will be recording the first part of my lecture on chapter 12, unemployment, our very last chapter in this course. Okay. So chapter 12, unemployment. Again, this is part 1 of my lecture. First, let me define unemployment. We may have done this really early in this course in chapter 1, if I'm not mistaken, but let me recap. So the way this is done is we take the working age population of the United States, the working age population, and this is essentially those who are 16 or older, not in the military, and not institutionalized. And when we say not institutionalized, we're essentially saying not in a mental institution, not in jail, etc. Right? So this is the working age population. And let's just call it WAP for short. Okay. Now this working age population can be broken up into these two subgroups. And the first subgroup is the labor force, and then the other one is out of the labor force, right? Labor force, let's call that LF, and out of labor force OLF, right? Then the labor force can be broken up into two subgroups, and these are the employed and the unemployed. Right, now let's work with the US government's definition of someone who is employed. To be employed, you essentially have to be working at least 1 hour per week for pay, or at least 15 hours a week without pay in a family business. I'm not writing that, I'm just saying that aloud. So 1 hour a week for pay, or 15 hours a week, at least 15 hours a week without pay in a family business. So that's someone who is employed. Now, who is unemployed? Now, unemployed, an unemployed person is not someone who is not employed. So in other words, non-employment, someone who is not employed is not equal to someone who is unemployed. There is a difference. And the difference is that the unemployed person is someone who is non-employed, meaning not even working 1 hour a week for pay. But in addition to that, this person has to be actively looking for work, right? So an unemployed person is basically a non-employed, actively looking for work. So that's the critical thing with the unemployed person, is looking for work, searching for a job, right? Now, how do we define the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate is calculated as follows. It is this percentage figure here. This is the unemployment rate. And how is that calculated? It's basically the number of the unemployed, this number here, let's call that U. Let's call these guys E, E for employed, U for unemployed. So the number unemployed expressed as a percentage of the labor force. So it's essentially the unemployed as a fraction or a percentage of the labor force. That's the unemployment rate, right? Next, let's look at some facts and figures. Again, I'm not going to dwell on the exact numbers. I may throw a few, but I leave you to read that in detail on your own. I'll just give you broad trends, if I may. So let's look at some time trends in US unemployment, right? So let's look at some time trends in national unemployment, right? And here are the broad time trends between 1950 and 1990. So we are talking about the 1950, well, that was well in the immediate post-World War II period, a time of great prosperity in America. Right now, in this period, despite the initial, the high prosperity in the 50s, 60s, etc., well, overall, there was an increasing trend. So in this period, there was a upward drift in the unemployment rate. Now, how would we show that graphically? Well, graphically, and this is just a stylized diagram. This is not the actual diagram. But in this period, 1950 to 1980, essentially, we saw the unemployment rate drifting upwards like this, right? So time on this axis, and the unemployment rate, UR for unemployment rate, on the vertical axis, we have an upward drift in the unemployment rate. Of course, lots of ups and downs, of course. There were recessions and so on. So in recessions, we had the curve sort of dipping down like this. In an expansion that would happen. In a boom, the unemployment rate drops like this. And then in a recession, it rises like this. And so we have this sort of cyclicality, but through it all, there is this positively sloped time trend, an upward drift. Right? Then from the period 1990 to 2008, there was a reversal, meaning a downward drift. So this was a period where the unemployment rate, the long-term trend, had a negative slope, meaning the unemployment rate seemed to be decreasing in this period. Downward trend or downward drift, right? But this, of course, was completely thrown off kilter by the events of 2008. We had the Great Recession. So immediately at that point, the unemployment rate climbed hugely, right? So that period 1990 to 2008, was that downward time trend, came abruptly to a halt in 2008. Right? So these are the broad time trends. Next, let's look at who are the unemployed. So let's next look at some characteristics of the unemployed. Who are the unemployed? Right? And let's first examine differences by educational level of the unemployed. Differences by education. And here we find that the unemployment rate decreases in education. In other words, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to become unemployed. That's what this is saying. The unemployment rates among the educated are smaller than among the less educated. Right? Now, the numbers that we have are that in 2017, for instance, the unemployment rate of college grads, which you are going to be in a few years, maybe a year or less. The unemployment rate of college graduates in 2017, the national rate was 2.3%. So of every 100 college graduates, only about 2 were unemployed. Right? Now, the unemployment rate of high school graduates was 4.6%, double, correct? And the unemployment rate of high school dropouts was even higher at 6.5%. So we see here that when you look at the unemployed, there are fewer college graduates among them, more high school graduates, and then many more high school dropouts. That would be the composition of the pool of the unemployed. Another thing that's notable here is that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to become unemployed in a recession. So the unemployment rate rises by less during recessions among the more educated, right? The less educated are more likely to become unemployed in a recession, right? So the unemployment rate of the more educated appear less sensitive to economic downturns, recessions. So your job is more protected if you are more educated. And you might ask why? Well, one explanation comes to mind, and this has to do with job training. I mentioned in, was it the lecture on, the lecture that we discussed job training in? I forget which lecture that was, which chapter that was. But one of the aspects of human capital accumulation is, and you might remember this, is that skill builds upon skill, right? So the more educated workers get more job training. You follow me? And some of this job training is firm-specific. Now, do you remember firm-specific job training? This is training that is not portable. It can't be taken to another employer. These are skills that are valuable only at the current employer, right? And if you remember that the cost of this training, firm-specific training, is shared by firm and worker. This sharing, in a sense, binds the two together because they both have to lose if the relationship were to break up, right? How is that? Because the employer has paid for part of the worker's training, the employer will now be paying the worker a little less than his productivity, his worth, to recoup the investment. So there is a benefit to keeping the worker on because the firm is making a bit of a profit on the guy by paying him a little less than what he's worth. And why is the firm paying him a little less again? Because the firm bore a portion of the cost of training this worker, right? So with firm-specific training, the firm and the worker are, in a sense, married, right? And that relationship then is strong enough to resist the effects of economic downturns. That's the idea, right? So one of the reasons why more educated workers are less likely to become unemployed in recessions is because they have more job training, particularly firm-specific job training. Another factor that's been observed is that the more educated workers are less likely to suffer unemployment when they switch jobs. So if a more educated worker quits a job, he's likely to find another one very quickly, right? So quitting a job is not going to result in a lot of unemployment for the more educated workers. So they have better networks, let us say, informational networks in the job market, right? So that's another observation. All right, next. Let's look at differences by race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity. Are there any differences in the probability of becoming unemployed, let us say, by race and ethnicity? And here it's basically been observed that the unemployment rate is lowest among Asians. So the Asian unemployment rate is lowest, and the whites are the next lowest group. Remember, the lower the unemployment, the more sort of privileged the group is, correct? So the Asians have the lowest unemployment rate, followed by whites, and this is followed by Hispanics, and blacks have the highest unemployment rates of all races / ethnicities in the US. Right? Now, one thing that is observable here, that if you look at the black-white difference, somebody might say, well, this is because blacks have lower skill levels. So maybe they're in a completely different job market than whites. That may be part of the reason why the white unemployment rate is lower than the black rate. But this black-white difference remains even when skill differences are controlled for. So this black-white difference in the unemployment rate remains even controlling for skill, meaning education. Once you control for education and job training and all that, you still find a black-white difference. So you take, in other words, you take a black high school graduate and a white high school graduate, and you find that the white high school graduate is less likely to be unemployed, than the black high school graduate. So same education level, but the black worker seems a bit worse off, is more likely to be unemployed. Right? And this may be partly, your chapter argues, this may be partly, so the reason, one reason could be the fact that there is residential segregation. In other words, blacks tend to live in areas where there are many other black folk living. So residential segregation could be part of the reason for why you have this black-white difference. So blacks tend to live in cities or neighborhoods that have more blacks in them than in the nation as a whole. The proportion of blacks that live in those neighborhoods is higher than in the nation as a whole. Right? So there is some residential segregation by race. And one of the arguments is that this type of segregation means that many blacks are cut off from the mainstream. So this means that black workers often have weaker informational networks, let us say, right? So this kind of racial segregation leads to blacks being cut off from the mainstream. Right, next. Let's look at gender differences. And here, the story is as follows. The unemployment rate of women used to be higher than for men. So women tended to be likelier to be unemployed in any given period than men. This used to be the case. But these days, there is pretty much no difference. So why was there a difference in the past? Well, one reason was the nature of the interrupted careers of women. And this is something we've spoken about before when we were talking about discrimination, I believe, right? And, well, traditionally, as is mentioned in that chapter, a lot of working women used to leave the labor force in their late 20s to get married, have children, etc. And at some point, when the children were somewhat grown up, many of them would re-enter the labor force. So they had an interrupted career, right? And this type of interruption, it has been argued, led to their unemployment rates, female unemployment rates, to be higher than the male unemployment rates. That used to be the case. But this difference appears to have disappeared of late. Next, let's look at industrial differences. And here we've learned that workers in agriculture, construction, and leisure and hospitality. People who work in resorts, hotels, restaurants, those kinds of workers. These workers have the highest unemployment rates. Highest unemployment rates. So these are the most vulnerable sort of industries out there. The least susceptible to unemployment were workers in government, not surprising, and in the financial industry. So these had the lowest unemployment rates. So there are differences by industry. Next, let us look at the unemployed by reason for unemployment. By reason for unemployment. And what do we see here? Well, essentially there are 4 reasons for being unemployed. When you ask unemployed workers why they are unemployed, 4 reasons are typically given, and they are: the worker is either a job loser, so this is a person who's been fired from the job, laid off, etc. Then you have the next category are workers who are job leavers. So job losers, job leavers. Next, we have new entrants. So these are freshly minted college graduates, high school graduates, etc. People entering the labor force for the first time and looking for a job, right? New entrants. And then lastly, we have re-entrants. So these are people who used to work, who used to be in the labor force, left it for a while, and then have now re-entered the labor force. Correct? So by the way, what happens to a worker who has left the labor force? Well, let's quickly look at our tree diagram here. A worker who leaves the labor force, let's say in the old days, a woman in her late 20s who decided to get married, so therefore quit her job. Where would that worker go? That worker would go from the pool of the employed, as you can see here, to this group there, out of the labor force. Right? At some point, this person might re-enter the labor force. And in that case, this woman, after her children are slightly grown, may re-enter, and in which case she will have to look for a job, and she will enter that group. Follow? So here are the reasons for unemployment. And when you look at the pool of the unemployed, you find that about half the unemployed, half of the unemployed are in fact job losers. So this seems to be the most important reason for unemployment, to be fired by the firm, right? The next biggest category is re-entrants. The next most likely to be unemployed are these guys here. Re-entrants. So that's the next common reason for unemployment. So we have these differences by reason. Next, let's look at differences by duration of unemployment. By duration of unemployment. And what do we see here? Now here we can think of at least two types, those who have been unemployed for less than 5 weeks, right? So let me write this way. So these are people who are short-term unemployed. So you can think of at least two types. So you have short-term unemployed and the long-term unemployed. Long-term unemployed are typically those who are unemployed for 26 or more weeks. Short-term would be 5 or less weeks. Right. So what's been observed here is that the number of the short-term unemployed, this figure has been falling. So the fraction of the unemployed who are short-term unemployed has been falling, whereas long-term unemployment is on the rise. Correct? So currently, these guys, the long-term unemployed, make up about 25% of the unemployed, long-term unemployed. So if people are out of a job, these guys remain out of a job for a long time, at least half a year or more. All right. Now, the next point I will make is that a large number of the unemployed are, strictly speaking, not counted as such, right? And here we have workers such as discouraged workers. Let me talk about these discouraged workers for a second. So the point I'm now making is that the official unemployment figures that we see are a bit misleading. They do not paint a true picture of our labor market. And these are the reasons. You have discouraged workers. Now, discouraged workers are essentially workers who have stopped their job search because they have become discouraged. So these are workers who want a job, who would happily take one if they were given one, but they have been unsuccessful in their job search for a long time. And this has essentially caused them to give up. So what happens when a job searching worker gives up? Well, if we go back to our tree here, this would mean that this worker is leaving the pool of the unemployed. Such a worker, a discouraged worker, would go from where to where? A discouraged worker would go from this box, the unemployed box, to out of the labor force. Correct? That's what a discouraged worker does. It leaves the unemployed, goes out of the labor force. Because if the person stops looking for a job, the government no longer counts him or her as unemployed. So by the way, what does this do to the unemployment rate? And let me give you a simple figure. So let's say that the labor force is 100 workers, and of these 100 workers, 90 are employed and 10 are unemployed. So what is the unemployment rate then? Wouldn't it be the 10 as a percentage of the 100? 10 divided by 100 multiplied by 100, which is equal to 10%. So the unemployment rate is 10%, correct? But now let's say that these 10 workers look for a job for a long time, and 5 of them stop looking for work, right? Now, if 5 of them stop looking for work, what would happen to these numbers here? Well, this 10 that you see here so this 10 would become 5. There will only be 5 unemployed workers left because 5 stopped looking for work. That, of course, would mean that the labor force also decreases by 5 because these 5 discouraged workers leave the labor force, right? They go to the pool of those out of the labor force. So this becomes 95, right? So what happens to our unemployment rate? It becomes 5 divided by 95 times 100. And what is that equal to? Well, if we use our calculators here, 5 divided by 95 times 100 is equal to 5.26%. Is that correct? Let me just double check again. 5 divided by 95 times 100. That's right, 5.26%. So you would think that the unemployment rate has fallen, correct? So this tells us that the unemployment rate has fallen. And we might think that our economy is improving. But really, our economy is not improving. It's a very poor economy, so poor that you have 5 job searching workers simply give up. So when workers give up, it causes the unemployment rate to fall. And this gives us a false sense that our economy is improving when it really isn't. Right? So that's something to keep in mind. And this is important for one reason, and that is that since 2008, the labor force participation rate, has been falling. And what does that mean? What's the labor force participation rate? I should mention it here. The labor force participation rate is the fraction of the labor force, or rather the fraction of the working age population that's in the labor force. So this is the percentage labor force participation rate, LFPR. So what is the labor force participation rate? It's the number in the labor force expressed as a fraction of the number in the working age population. And I mentioned that this number has been shrinking. And this, of course, can only happen when a lot of people are leaving the labor force and going out of the labor force. Right? So since 2008, this is what has happened. So the Great Recession of 2008 essentially caused some workers to lose their jobs. And many of them, it seems, never found another one. And they have now, by now, stopped looking. They've simply retired, left the labor force. Now, these are workers who might actually want to work, many of them, right? But many of them have decided to get some disability or something, and they've left the labor force because they have been unsuccessful in finding a job once the economy recovered from the Great Recession. Right. So this is something to keep in mind, and this is a point your book makes, that our unemployment rates of late, the unemployment rates that the government has been publishing since the end of the Great Recession are somewhat misleading, because since the Great Recession we've had a large exodus from the labor force, right? And as I said, when people leave the labor force, the unemployment rate tends to fall, right? But this is not a sign of an improving economy, because many of the people leaving the labor force might actually be discouraged workers. Right. All right, next. Let's look at the types of unemployment. And economists classify the unemployed as belonging to different types. Types of unemployment. And there are essentially 4 types of unemployment. You have first frictional unemployment, then seasonal unemployment, next structural unemployment, and lastly cyclical unemployment. Right, so let's quickly discuss these. So the frictionally unemployed are basically the unemployed that you would see even when the economy is booming. So these kinds of unemployed workers would always be there. So even when the economy is booming, when there is an economic boom, you would see these frictionally unemployed workers. So these workers are unemployed as a result of the normal turnover. So that's the phrase used, the normal turnover in the labor market. Normal turnover in the labor market. What's meant by normal turnover in the labor market? You see, every day you have workers who might quit their jobs because, let's say, they have to move from the valley to Houston. So let's say that we have a nurse, right? Her skills are in high demand, and for domestic reasons, she decides to leave the valley and move to, let's say, Houston. Right, so she quits her job here, moves to Houston. Now, will she find a job in a hospital or a doctor's office immediately? Well, perhaps not, because she doesn't know which doctors, which hospitals in Houston are currently hiring. She doesn't know that. She has to, in other words, because of her lack of information, she has to engage in job search. And in this period, when she's engaging in job search, she is frictionally unemployed. So this is what's meant by frictional unemployment. And this you would see even when the economy is doing great. So the economy might be booming, and yet you would see some frictionally unemployed workers because of this normal, usual turnover in the labor market. Workers quitting, looking for another job, finding it, etc. In the period in which they are job searching, they are frictionally unemployed. So this is not a very serious kind of unemployment. The next kind of unemployment is called seasonal unemployment. Right? And this again is not very serious. So in other words, there are some industries, some occupations that have a seasonal nature to them. Right? For instance, if you're an ice cream seller, then your business pretty much lasts during the summer and it cools off in the winter. So your firm might lay you off in the winter time and rehire you again next summer. So there is a seasonality to this, correct? If you're working as a fisherman, let's say, working in a fishing trawler, catching fish in the oceans, again, there is a seasonality to this. So there are some months of the year when you can't catch fish because there aren't any, right? So this is what's meant by seasonal unemployment. You often see this even in the auto industry, because just when the new models are coming out, the factories actually close down. Why? Because they have to retool their machines because they're going to be producing a new model from now on. So the machines have to be recalibrated, etc. In this period, when the factory shut down, workers are laid off. They become unemployed for a period. Usually this is sometime in the summer. Right? So this is, again, not a very serious kind of unemployment. The next kind of unemployment is called structural unemployment. And this is unemployment that results from the changing structure of the economy. And what's meant by the changing structure of the economy? Well, the fact is that you have some industries that are dying out in the United States and others that are growing, right? And why does this happen? Well, if you think about it, when the United States was founded in 1776, we were largely an agrarian economy. Agriculture was our main industry, correct? And then by the mid-1800s or the late 1800s, we began to become an industrial economy, right? And we remained this industrial economy until perhaps the 70s, right? And thereafter, our industries, our heavy industries, in particular iron and steel, for instance, began to decline, right? Our electronics industry, the manufacture of televisions, for instance, declined, right? And so these factories began to close, and those workers were laid off. And they are now laid off. Why? Because these industries are dying. And why are these industries dying? Because of changing patterns of what is called international comparative advantage. The US used to have a comparative advantage in heavy industry. It's lost that comparative advantage to many East Asian countries like South Korea, China, etc. Right, even countries in Latin America, right? And so those factories are closing down. And we are at the same time developing a comparative advantage in high technology areas, software engineering, for instance, or the manufacture of high-tech medical equipment. Right, so those are areas, those are industries that are on their way up. Right. But the point is that because of some industries dying out, you're going to have some unemployed workers. And these unemployed workers are called structurally unemployed workers. Now, they might be unemployed for a long time. In fact, for them to become employable again, they have to acquire new skills because their old skills are no longer in high demand. Right? A steel worker who's been laid off from the steel industry has skills in making steel, but those skills are not in high demand because the whole industry is declining. Right? So this is a more serious kind of unemployment. And lastly, we have cyclical unemployment. And this is unemployment that is related to the business cycle. Right? The business cycle. And what's the business cycle? The business cycle is and let me write that a little more clearly. the business cycle is the overall ups and downs of our economy, right? Recessions followed by economic expansions, followed by recessions, etc. Right? So this is unemployment that is related to the business cycle. So this is unemployment that's due to recessions. Right? So these are our 4 kinds of unemployment. And for the remainder of this section of the lecture, I'll be talking about frictional unemployment. So let's start by talking about this kind of unemployment. Right? And here I'm going to introduce a little bit of math, right? And this is a slight mathematical model, of frictional unemployment. And here is our story. So let me lay out our variables, right? So we have u at any point in time. So at any point in time, for example, a month, during any month, the following are some facts. We have the number of employed. We have a certain number of employed workers in any month, and we're going to represent that by the letter E, right? We also have a number of unemployed workers, and we're going to call them U, right? The other thing that I will mention here is that in that month, a fraction L will become unemployed. So these are workers who might say lose their jobs. Fraction L. And in that same month, a fraction H of the unemployed will become employed. Right? So this essentially means the following. So from this we can get the following, that every month the number of workers who become freshly unemployed, right? So the number who become unemployed is going to be what? L times E. The fraction L, remember, becomes unemployed, and there are total E employed workers. So the number of the employed who become unemployed this month would be L times E, correct? And from this, we arrive at the following. The number of employed, the number of the unemployed who find jobs number of unemployed finding work in this month would be how much? Would be H times U, because the fraction H of the number U becomes employed, right? So let's think of something called a steady state. So what's a steady state? A steady state would be, the idea will become clear in a second, but essentially we're talking about a position of rest, a steady state. So in steady state, this is what we would want. We would want the number of workers becoming unemployed to be equal to the number of workers becoming employed. We want these two flows to be the same. Now you think about this, right? So you have, let me draw these two balls, okay? and this will become clear in a second. So this is the total number of the employed, and this is the total number of the unemployed, correct? Now, every month, you're going to have some employed workers who lose their jobs, right? And that is L times E, right? At the same time, every month you have some unemployed workers who find work, right? So you'd have a reverse flow like this, and that would be H times U. Now, what if these two flows were identical? If these two flows were identical, wouldn't this number here be a constant? It wouldn't change, right? Why? Because the number joining them every month is exactly equal to the numbers leaving. So this would be constant, and that would be constant. And with these two numbers being constant, you're going to end up with a constant unemployment rate. That's the idea. That's what's meant by steady state, right? So let's work through the algebra here. So in steady state, as I've said, so in steady state, what do we have? We have the number of the employed losing their jobs, L times E, would be equal to the number of unemployed workers who find jobs, H times U. Correct? Right? Now, we know from our tree diagram that the labor force consists of the employed and the unemployed. Correct? So in other words, we know that the labor force is equal to E plus U. Correct? So therefore we can, this of course implies that the number employed can be written as labor force minus the unemployed. Correct? So let's do this then. Let's take this and let's replace the employed number here with that. So let's do this little substitution here. Correct? If we do that substitution, this equation that we have here, the equation that describes steady state, can now be written as L in brackets, the labor force minus the unemployed is equal to H times the unemployed. Correct? The next step is this. Let's divide both sides by U. So if we divide both sides by U, this is what we get. We get L in brackets, LF minus U divided by U is equal to HU divided by U, because this U and this U cancel out, correct? Right? And also we can simplify this as L in brackets, labor force divided by U minus 1 is equal to H. Correct? Now let's divide both sides by L. If we divide both sides by L, what will we get? We'll essentially get LF divided by U minus 1. There'll be no L now because we're dividing by L, is equal to H divided by L. Correct? Finally, let's take the minus 1 to the other side of the equal sign. That's, in other words, add 1 to both sides. 1 to both sides. If we add 1 to both sides, we get LF divided by U is equal to H divided by L plus 1. And this can be written as H divided by L plus L divided by L, because L divided by L is 1, isn't it? And this can finally be written as H plus L divided by L. Correct? So that's LF divided by U. Finally, let's do this. Let's take the reciprocal. Take the reciprocal, in other words, flip it around, flip the fraction around. If we do that, we get U divided by LF is equal to L divided by H plus L. Correct? Now this must look familiar because if you multiply this by 100, right, of course, if you do that, you multiply the other side by 100 too. But what this is, well, this is nothing but the unemployment rate. That's the definition of the unemployment rate. Right? And this unemployment rate would be steady state unemployment. This would be the steady state unemployment rate. In other words, this would not change. Correct? This unemployment rate would always be there. Right? So we have an expression for the steady state unemployment rate. And what is that expression? It's this. Right? And what do we call this steady state unemployment? Well, we can call this the frictional unemployment rate. The fraction of the labor force that is going to be frictionally unemployed. You would always see these guys unemployed, even when the economy is booming. Right? So this is one way to think about the frictional unemployment rate. This is nothing but steady state unemployment. Right? So we can see here quite clearly that the frictional rate of unemployment would be higher if L were to go up. Right? So this is higher the bigger is L. Now you might wonder about that because L is in the numerator and the denominator, correct? But here's what I could quickly show you. Consider the fraction 2 by 3, correct? Now let's add 1 to both the numerator and the denominator, right? Add 1 to both. That's kind of like what's going on here. If you raise the L in the numerator, you raise the L in the numerator and the denominator. What happens to the fraction? It becomes 3 by 4. Now isn't 3 by 4 bigger than the original 2 by 3? Right? So this is going to be higher the bigger is L. Right? And it's going to be smaller the bigger is H. Now let's remember what L and H are. Right? What is L? L is the probability that an employed worker becomes unemployed this month. Right? It's a fraction of currently employed workers who will lose their jobs this month. And what is H? H is the probability that an unemployed worker shall become employed this month. In other words, that's the fraction of this month's unemployed workers will find a job. Right? So the frictional rate of unemployment is higher. The higher is the probability of job loss this month. And it's lower, the greater the probability of an unemployed worker becoming hired, finding a job. Right? So this is our steady state unemployment rate to be interpreted as the frictional unemployment rate. All right. So I mentioned that frictional unemployment is the kind of unemployment we observe because of the usual turnover in the labor market. I gave the example of the nurse who has to move to Houston for family reasons, and so quits her job here, moves to Houston, and has to look for a job there. Right? And in that interim period is considered frictionally unemployed. So here we need an idea, a theory then of job search. Right? So to understand frictional unemployment, we need to understand job search. Why do workers actually have to look for work? Right? And the idea here is quite simple, is that workers look for work because even though they might have a job in hand, right? Even that nurse, she might be very quickly able to locate a hiring hospital or doctor's office in her neighborhood, in a new neighborhood in Houston. She might be able to do this very quickly. But she may not settle for that job. She may not settle for the job because she will think, well, this is a big city, and I might be able to get a higher wage if I look some more, right? So the prospect of getting an even higher wage than one's current wage offer is what keeps workers searching, right? So the idea here then is we need to think in terms of a distribution of wages. So we need a wage distribution. Now, those of you who've done some statistics will, of course, be familiar with the normal distribution, correct? So we needn't have a, we need to work with a normal distribution. But the point is that this is what the worker, that nurse, for instance, would be faced with, right? And this is what it looked like. This is on the horizontal axis. We will measure all the wages that she is capable of being offered in the city of Houston, right? And this has a distribution. It's like this. May not be normal, but let's for simplicity draw. That's what looks like a symmetrical normal distribution, right? What do the heights represent? What are we measuring along the vertical axis? Along the vertical axis, we can measure what's called probability. So the probability that she will receive a wage offer of $5 an hour is given by the height of that dotted line. And the probability that she will get $8 an hour, because these are very low, these are not realistic hourly wages for nurses. Nurses get much more than that. But the probability that she will receive a wage offer of $8 is higher, correct? And then we can go on like this, and $22, the probability is now lower, again, lower than $8, and the probability of even higher wages starts to drop off. Erase that a second. So the probability of receiving higher and higher offers starts to drop off. So once we arrive at, let's say, $50 an hour, the chance that she will receive a high wage like that is extremely small. So the nurse faces a wage distribution, right? Now, what is her optimal search strategy? Well, her optimal search strategy will be to engage in what's called sequential search. What's meant by sequential search? Sequential search means that in her mind, the worker has to have what's called an asking wage. Or you can think of this as her reservation wage. She will not take an offer less than this. So let's call this WA. So in her mind, she has to formulate an asking wage. And her strategy will be to accept the first job, the first offer that is equal to this or bigger. She will accept it. She will stop searching at that point. This is considered to be the optimal search strategy. Correct? So you go from employer to employer to employer. In your mind is a minimum acceptable wage. And the first hospital or doctor's office that offers the nurse her asking wage or beats it, the nurse will accept that job. Right? Now with these ideas in mind, we can now draw a marginal benefit curve from further search. Right? And this will essentially look like this. So what I'm going to be measuring along the horizontal axis is the current wage offer. So let's say the nurse has an offer at hand, a current wage offer, right? And what we're going to measure along the vertical axis is the marginal benefit from refusing the offer and continuing to search, right? So this is the marginal benefit of continued search. And what does that marginal benefit curve look like? Well, it will look negatively sloped, and I'll explain this in a second. And let's say that the nurse's current wage offer is $5, right? So that's the $5 that we have here in this wage distribution. Now you can see that $5 is way to the left, correct? So there's a very high probability that the next offer the nurse receives, the offer that of course the nurse can only receive if the nurse continues job searching, right? The probability of a higher offer is very high, correct? Why? Because the entire distribution, almost the entire distribution, is to the right of $5, correct? So there's a very high benefit to searching because there's a very high chance, high probability that the worker will be able to find the next wage offer that will be much higher than this $5, right? So since the probability that the next wage offer is going to be higher than the current wage offer of $5 is what causes there to be a very high marginal benefit from continuing to search, right? So once again, why is the marginal benefit very high? This red dotted line that you see here, why is that very high? Well, it's because $5 is very far to the left in this wage distribution that you see here in the diagram above, right? Now, on the other hand, if the current wage offer is $50, now the marginal benefit from continued search is much smaller. And why is that? Because you see this 50 here, it's at the right tail of the distribution of wages. So there's a very small probability that the next wage offer shall be higher than 50, just by looking at the shape of this wage distribution, right? So there's a very small chance that any other employer will beat this $50 wage offer, the current offer of the nurse, correct? So if the nurse has got a current wage offer of $50, some hospital has offered the nurse $50 an hour, the marginal benefit to the nurse from refusing the offer and continuing to search is quite low, correct? And that's because of the shape of the wage distribution. The fact that that $50 wage is in the right tail of the wage distribution, right? So this is the marginal benefit from continued search, correct? Now in this very diagram, we can throw in a marginal cost curve, the marginal cost of continued search, right? So what would be the marginal cost of continued search if the worker has a current wage offer of $5? If the worker has been offered $5 currently, and the worker decides to reject the offer, and continue searching, what is the marginal cost of doing so? Well, it's going to be at least the $5, because by refusing the offer, you're giving up the $5. Remember the notion of opportunity cost, right? So this $5 will be part of the marginal cost. Now, there would be other costs, of course, the cost of actually subscribing to the newspapers, to look at the job ads, right? To perhaps drive around town looking for, hiring signs and doctors' offices. All of that is an additional marginal cost, right? But there would be at least the marginal cost of the wage offer, the current wage offer itself, right? If you're refusing the current offer of $5 an hour, well, your marginal cost of further search will be at least $5, maybe more, if you add gas and newspaper subscriptions and all that stuff, right? So essentially then, the higher the current job offer, the higher the marginal cost of further search from an opportunity cost point of view, correct? So we can draw here in this very diagram a marginal cost of search curve, and it will be perhaps something like that. It'll be steeper than 45 degrees. Now, where did I come up with the 45 degrees? Because the 45-degree line has the following property. This is 45 degrees, and any distance here would also be equal to that distance there, correct? So if this is $5, right, then that height will also be $5. But that's not counting the the additional direct costs of search, which is driving around in your car, burning gas, and subscribing to newspapers for the job ads and all that stuff, right? So in actual fact, then, the marginal cost of further search would actually be higher than this. It'll be somewhere here. So if we pass a line like this, it's steeper than 45 degrees. It has to be at least 45 degrees, the slope. But if you add other costs, it'll be steeper, right? So let's now, in this diagram, let's say that the nurse's current job offer, is here. Let's call that $8. Will the nurse accept that offer? No, the answer is no. How's that? Because you can see here quite clearly that the marginal cost is that height of that dotted line, but the marginal benefit is bigger. So at a current wage offer of $8, the marginal benefit of further search, the marginal benefit of rejecting the offer and searching, continuing to search, is greater than the marginal cost of doing so. So the worker will engage in further search. So at what wage offer will the worker decide not to search any further? Well, clearly that would be where these two curves intersect, because this is where the marginal cost and the marginal benefit from further search are equal to each other. Correct? And this is what we would call the worker's asking wage. So this is how the asking wage is determined. Right? Remember again, what is the asking wage? In sequential search, the worker has the asking wage in mind, right, and will accept any job offer with that wage or higher. It's the minimum acceptable wage. Right? So this diagram tells us that this is how WA is determined by the intersection of the marginal benefit curve from further search and the marginal cost curve from further search. Right? And there have been some studies on workers asking wages. And the first question we might ask is, are there any demographic differences? So are there any demographic differences in the asking wage, workers' asking wages? And the answer is yes. It turns out that blacks have a lower asking wage than whites. And how do we explain this? Now, this can be explained as follows. For white workers, the marginal benefit curve may be to the right, like this. So this may be the marginal benefit from further search for white workers. So they might find it, the benefits of rejecting a current offer and continuing to search to be higher than for black workers. So this is the marginal benefit for black workers, and the curve above is for white workers. And why might that be? That's because the entire wage distribution for white workers may be to the right of the wage distribution for black workers. So this is the wage distribution. For white workers. And the black line is the wage distribution for black workers. Right? So now when the white worker gets a $5 wage offer, well, he is much more likely to get a higher wage offer if he continues searching than the black worker, because the white worker's entire wage distribution is to the right. Do you follow me? So because of that, the marginal benefit curve from further search is higher for white workers. And it's no surprise, therefore, that they have a higher asking wage. So this is the asking wage of white workers. And you might think of this as the asking wage of black workers. Right? Another thing that's been observed is that the asking wage depends quite a lot on the unemployment history of the worker. Workers who tend to have longer spells of past unemployment are observed to have higher asking wages. And, well, that's not surprising. This is a choosy worker, a worker who has a high asking wage currently, perhaps had a high asking wage in the past. Correct? And what does a high asking wage in the past do? It means you're going to be unemployed for longer. Why? Because with a high asking wage, the probability of receiving a wage offer that equals it or beats it is smaller than if your asking wage were lower. Correct? So workers with high asking wages, in other words, choosy workers, tend to have longer spells of unemployment. Not surprising because, as I said, the higher a worker's asking wage, the lower the probability of receiving a wage offer that is equal to it or beats it. Correct? What is going to be the effect of unemployment compensation on the asking wage and how choosy workers are? Right? So when I say a worker is a very choosy worker, this worker is going to have a higher asking wage. Correct? So the next subsection here is the effect of unemployment benefits on the asking wage. Now we know that in the US, an unemployed worker can receive unemployment benefits, and they would depend on the wage at the last job, right? However, there is a minimum and a maximum. So let's say you're a doctor and you're making $200,000 a year or more, and you lose your job, right? Unemployment benefits are going to be, well, they're going to be only about $450 a month for you. You max out, in other words, correct? So there is an upper limit on the unemployment benefits, right? So keep that in mind. So now in many European countries, the unemployment benefits are more generous than in the US. So what is going to be the effect on the asking wage of the worker of generous unemployment benefits? Or just, let's consider the mere existence of unemployment benefits. What would that do? Right. Let's start with that first. So I'm going to replicate the diagram I had before. Right. So in this diagram, on the horizontal axis, we have the current wage offer. Right. And on the vertical axis, we measure the marginal benefit as well as the marginal cost from continued search, from rejecting the current offer and continuing to search. And as I've mentioned, the marginal benefit curve is negatively sloped. The marginal cost curve is positively sloped. Correct? Now, I mentioned that one of the marginal costs of continuing to search is the opportunity cost of giving up the current wage offer. Correct? So let's say that the worker has a current wage offer of $8 an hour, right? However, the government is paying a $3 an hour unemployment benefits. Of course, it wouldn't be an hourly figure. The unemployment benefit is simply a lump sum a month. But if we consider a week to be 40 hours a week, you can think of a month as being 160 hours of work. So if we divide the 450 by 160, we arrive at a figure, right? So let's say that the unemployment benefits translates to $3 an hour, right? So this would mean that if this worker decided to reject this $8 offer, what is the opportunity cost? It's no longer going to be the full 8. How is that? Because if the worker continues to search, the government is going to give him $3 an hour, right? So his marginal cost of continuing to search is no longer $8. It's actually 8 minus 3 or $5, right? Because by remaining unemployed, the government assists this person by paying him $3 for every hour in job search, let's say, right? So by engaging in this extra hour of job search, this worker is giving up the $8 wage that he might have earned had he accepted the last wage offer, correct? But this is not the entire cost. Why? Because the government's going to pay him $3. So really, by continued search, he's giving up only 8 minus 3 of $5, correct? So in other words, the entire marginal cost curve that you see here, shifts down like this. It's cheaper to engage in search when the government, in a sense, subsidizes the expense of search by giving you an unemployment benefit, correct? So what is the effect of this on the asking wage? Well, it's not surprising that without unemployment benefits, this would be the asking wage, WA. With the unemployment benefits, the asking wage is higher. So the worker becomes choosier. And with a higher asking wage, of course, the duration of unemployment will increase. The worker will remain unemployed longer, for the simple reason that with a higher asking wage, there is a lower probability of receiving an offer, a wage offer, equaling it or beating it. Correct? So it's not surprising that in European countries, there is very high frictional unemployment. A lot of workers are choosy. They linger on in unemployment because the government pays them generous unemployment benefits. Correct? Now in the US, we observe that the poor or the less skilled, the low skilled, they tend to remain unemployed for longer than the more skilled. Now you might say that this is partly because the highly skilled workers have good labor market informational networks. So that's partly true, yes. But another factor has to do with the structure of unemployment benefits. As I mentioned, in many states, you're capped off at some low amount like $450 a month. Correct? So if you're an engineer or a doctor earning a very high salary and you lose your job and you receive these unemployment benefits, your replacement ratio, let me mention this, your replacement ratio is going to be really low. What's meant by replacement ratio? That's the percentage of your last wage replaced by unemployment benefits. Right? And this is going to be very low for high wage individuals. And this is for the simple reason that unemployment benefits have a very low cap. The maximum is quite low. So this means that if a highly skilled person receives a certain wage offer, decides to reject it and continue searching, the marginal cost curve will decrease. This downward movement here, is going to be very modest, very small for a highly skilled worker. Why? Because unemployment benefits as a fraction of the offered wage are going to be very small. Correct? So with a very small subsidization of job search, there will be a very small increase in the asking wage. In other words, the existence of unemployment benefits are not going to raise a skilled worker's asking wage by very much. Why? Because the benefits are capped. And so even the highest benefit is a very small fraction of the worker's current wage offer. Right? On the other hand, for a less skilled worker, the replacement ratio is typically quite large. Right? Why? Because there is a lower bound on that benefit. So the maximum is $450, but the lower bound is something like $70, $80, something like that. But that $70, $80 could be a very large fraction of the low-skilled worker's monthly wage. So the replacement ratio is larger. And so a low-skilled worker's marginal cost curve would shift downward by a lot, right? And that would cause the asking wage to increase by a lot. Right? I hope I'm understood here. So my point is the structure of unemployment benefit, the fact that it has a upper bound and a lower bound. This means that highly skilled workers with high wage offers will be less inclined to continue searching because the unemployment benefits are a very small fraction of the current offered wage. For a low-skilled worker, on the other hand, the unemployment benefits might actually be a higher fraction of the current offer wage, providing an incentive to reject the current offer and to continue searching. Right? So this might partly explain the fact that in the US, low-skilled workers tend to be unemployed for longer spells than highly skilled workers. Right? Now, there's one last thing that I will mention, and that has to do with the phenomena of temporary layoffs. Now, what's a temporary layoff? This is when a firm lays off workers with the possibility that these workers will be recalled back to their old jobs in some time. Right? Now, this might often happen in areas where there is some seasonality in the business. So there could be slow periods during which the firm lays off a bunch of workers. Right? And what do these workers do? Of course, when you're unemployed, you ask for unemployment benefits from the government. Right? Now, if you think about unemployment benefits, how are they funded? How does the government raise the funds for paying unemployed workers these unemployment benefits? And the way it works in the US is that firms pay a certain payroll tax. Right? So firms pay a payroll tax to the government, and these monies are then used to finance the unemployment benefits program. Right? And how are these payroll taxes assessed? Well, firms that have a history of high layoffs, right? Firms that have a history of high layoffs actually pay more taxes, right? So the percentage payroll tax levied on firms with a high history of layoffs is higher than for firms with low layoffs in the past. But here too there is a problem, and that is that there is a upper limit here, right? So a firm that lays off a lot is not taxed as much as it should be, right? So such a firm then will find it convenient to, perhaps in times of slow business, when there is a lull in the business, these firms will be tempted to lay off a bunch of workers, knowing full well that taxes paid by other firms will subsidize the cost of paying these workers unemployment benefits. Correct? That's the sound of my dog lapping water. I apologize. So here's my argument again. The unemployment benefits are funded by these payroll taxes that firms pay. Right? It's a percentage of the total dollar payroll of a company. Right? Now, firms that have laid off a lot of workers in the past are assessed a higher percentage tax. But that percentage is capped. So if you're a firm that has laid off a lot in the past, you are not taxed commensurately. You're undertaxed. Right? So this means that if you're a firm in the habit of laying off a lot of workers because of the seasonal nature of your business, you'll be happy to lay off lots of workers because you know that you're not going to be punished for it with high taxes. Why? Because the tax rate has an upper limit, a cap. So this would mean that you, the firm, will be tempted to overuse temporary layoffs. So you'll happily lay off workers, right? When there's a lull in your business, knowing full well that they will receive unemployment benefits for which you will not be taxed quite as much, right? So in other words, other firms are subsidizing the cost of paying the unemployment benefits to your laid off workers, right? And because your workers are going to receive these unemployment benefits, they will perhaps remain unemployed, enabling you to then rehire them once business picks up. Now, you can only do this if there are unemployment benefits out there, because if your workers have no unemployment benefits, they won't just hang around waiting to be rehired by you. They will work for somebody else. And you don't want that to happen. You want them to linger on in unemployment until you can bring them back. Right? And you may want them back because, let's say, they have some firm-specific skills that you value. Right? So in this environment, you'll be happy to lay them off, knowing full well that the government will look after them when they're unemployed, so they won't just, find another job. And then when business picks up, you can quickly rehire them. Right? So there is this incentive then because of the nature of the taxes, as I said. There is no penalty to a firm that lays off a lot of workers, right? It's not as if a firm that lays off a lot of workers will be assessed a much higher percentage payroll tax in the future. Why? Because the payroll tax has a cap. The percentage tax has a cap, right? And that really brings me to the end of part 1 of my lecture.